My special live bibliotherapy session tonight, which is all about ghostly tales in literature. I would love to hear if you have particular ghostly tales that you love or that have embedded themselves into your consciousness and terrified you over the years, making you never want to go to bed without the lights being on. We at the salon thought that it would be a lovely idea to have a special session on ghosts, seeing as we're leading up to Halloween, and October could be called our ghostliest month for many reasons. And while I'm just waiting for some of you to get comfortable and settled, possibly lighting a candle and maybe making yourself a spooky cocktail, I hope so, then I would love to just share with you a slightly sinister image that came from Indonesia. In Indonesia, during lockdown, there have been volunteers who have been dressing up as what's called shroud ghosts. And they've been wearing these very sinister outfits. They've been making themselves look like ghosts so as to scare off the residents of their 5,000 strong neighborhood. And you can see they really do look pretty terrifying in order to make people stay at home. And also in Indonesia, they've been getting the police force to dress up with these very radical COVID uh, scary helmets so as to make people stay at home. And that's just to show that ghosts still have an amazing power to terrify us, even in the 21st century. And I would love to know if you have any ghosts which you maybe first read about in childhood or that you've been shared with by your parents from stories that they knew from literature or that they still know. And if so, send us a message here on Damien Barr's Literary Salon Facebook or Instagram page, or send me an email at ella@ellabear2.com and tell me about your most spooky tales. I apologise if the internet connection is slightly slow on Facebook. It seems to be better on Instagram for some reason, but if you're able to swap between the two, feel free. And do send me messages if you have any particular ghost stories that you would love to tell me about, whether it's from a novel or from a short story. And welcome to Colleen and Ollie. Great to have you back here this evening. Welcome to all the many people joining us on both Instagram and Facebook. It's lovely to have you here for this special evening of ghostly stories. So, what I want to start by asking is, why do we love ghost stories? What is it about them that we find so thrilling and irresistible? I know not everyone does, and those people tell us why you hate ghost stories, perhaps. But for many of us, we do love ghost stories because we love to have that sense of thrill, that sense of being haunted, that sense of a chill down our spines while we are safely at home within our cozy bedclothes, maybe curled up by a fire with a good book or a short story, or we might be reading by torchlight in a tent, reading ghost stories, and we feel comparatively safe and happy in our own cozy bed while we're reading about the terrifying things going on in our stories. So that's one reason that we do love to have that vicarious thrill of something scary while we're actually knowing that we're safe and cozy ourselves. Another reason that we can love ghost stories is that we find it an interesting way of thinking about the afterlife. It can be a way of helping us to cope with the idea of death. If we think about whether ghosts might exist after we die, we meet them in our ghostly tales, and we have the opportunity to ponder whether people do linger on in some form after death. And there are many books in which that happens, such as The Lovely Bones by Alice Sebold, which is a book which many people have found oddly comforting, even though it is a depressing tale, because of the portrayal of heaven in that book. Another book that I'm going to talk about tonight is Beyond Black by Hilary Mantel, which is a really fantastic ghostly tale. And in that book, the dead are extremely present in the life of the medium, who's the heroine of the novel. So it's thinking about the afterlife, it's being vicariously thrilled while knowing that we're safe and cozy. It's also perhaps facing demons that we might really have or have observed in our lives. And that's very much true of Beyond Black, the Hilary Mantel novel. It's very much about the main character facing her own demons. Also, that's very true in The Shining by Stephen King, which is one of the most famous ghostly tales which people often cite as a story that they love. Admittedly, people often know it from the film as much as they do from the novel. But I have to say, the novel is brilliant and I really do recommend it. But in that book, the hero, Jack, who is the father of the boy, Danny, that's at the center of the tale, has a lot of demons which he has to deal with, and they are partly to do with his own past and his alcoholism, and also his own abuse as a child at the hands of his father. And he has a sense of madness coming out through all the ghosts that surround him at the Overlook Hotel. So ghostly tales can be a way of our, as of readers, facing the demons that they might have in their own real lives, or that they might be aware of other people around them having. And seeing them personified as ghosts can be a helpful way of stepping back from them and personifying them as something other, and therefore dealing with them at a slight distance. So ghosts can actually be very helpful in literature in a bibliotherapeutic style. Ghosts can also explain the inexplicable when we experience strange events in our lives which we just can't put a finger on and we can't say what they are all about. We can find answers in the form of ghostly tales. The ghostly stories can also be metaphors for either things that we can't understand, but also for grim realities in our lives, such as cancer or illness. And those are some of the things that we're going to be talking about this evening. So one of the things I wanted to start by sharing with you is the idea of ghostly tales being partly thrilling because of the book covers that we find are so frequently associated with thrillers and ghost stories. Books like this is actually a very old book of mine, is just a thrill to pick up because it's got this fantastic cover which makes you feel it's going to be full of something rather terrifying and exciting. There are other wonderful books that surround me. This is A.F. Benson's Ghost Stories. There's this quite ancient tome as well, which is falling apart, which has a really scary cover. And it's often the cover itself that does set the scene for the fear that the story gives you. The titles are also frequently terrifying. They might be called things like The Mystery of Marie Roget, The Monkey's Paw, The Ragman's Uncle, The Hangman's Noose, and so on, The Mad Monk. And those titles are enough to give you a thrill of terror in themselves. So it's the book cover and the titles that lead you in to the thrill of the story as much as the story itself. There was actually a story that I read in my teens, which was a ghost story, which my mother also read. And she and I were both completely terrified by this story. And it was in a book a bit like this one, an ancient dusty tome, which we had found in my grandparents' attic in Devon. They lived in a very big, spooky old house that had a huge, terrifying attic. And my mum and I used to go up there every now and then and find exciting clothes and wonderful ancient artifacts and books. And one of the things we found was this old book full of ghost stories. We both read many of these stories together. And a few years before we died, my mum and I talked about this particular story that we'd been terrified by, but we couldn't remember the title or the author. And I'm afraid we still can't. But the reason I'm mentioning it is that I still get an absolute chill of terror down my spine when I think about that title and that story, even though I don't know who it was by, what it was called, and what the story was. But I would love to find it. But then there's also that fear that maybe when I find it, I might be terribly disappointed. And there's something very important about ghost stories, which is to do with their ineffable nature, their mysteriousness, and the fact that there's something that you can't quite put your finger on. So in a way, maybe it's a good thing that I can't find that story, and maybe I never will. Hello, Jacqueline from Maryland, USA. It's great to have you joining us. And thanks a lot for all the other people that are coming along for this lovely evening of ghost stories. I wonder if you've got any particular stories that you have from your neighborhood that you might want to share with us this evening. Maybe you could write a little message either on Instagram or Facebook, or send me an email and I'll share it with people later. But I would love to hear your own favourite ghost stories, whether they're short stories, novels, or even oral histories. So, thinking about these lovely old books and the way that they can often be the entry into a scary story, I'm just going to read you one beginning of a story from this lovely book, and it's called The Leech of Folkestone. It's by R.H. Barham, and R.H. Barham was actually a canon of St. Paul's, and he was known for writing his particularly bizarre and often quite satirical stories. And I want to read you the beginning of it because it's a great classic start of a short story. Reader, were you ever bewitched? I do not mean by a white wench's black eye, or by love potions imbibed from a ruby lip, but were you ever really and bona fide bewitched in the true Matthew Hopkins sense of the word? Did you ever, for instance, find yourself from head to heel one vast complication of cramps? Or burst out into sudorific exudation like a cold thaw with the thermometer at 0? Were your eyes ever turned upside down, exhibiting nothing but their whites? Did you ever vomit a paper of crooked pins? Or expectorate Whitechapel needles? These are genuine and undoubted marks of possession. And if you never experienced any of them, why? Happy man be his dole. Yet such things have been. Yea, we are assured, and that on no mean authority, still are. The world, according to the best geographers, is divided into Europe, Asia, Africa, America, and Romney Marsh. In this last named and fifth quarter of the globe, a witch may still be occasionally discovered in favourable, i.e., stormy seasons, weathering Dungeness Point in an eggshell, or careering on her broomstick over Dymchurch Wall. A cow may yet be sometimes seen galloping like mad, with tail erect and an old pair of breeches on her horns, an unerring guide to the door of the crone whose magic arts have drained her udder. I do not, however, remember to have heard that any conjurer has of late been detected in this district. I won't go on, but that's one of the stories from this really gorgeous volume. And it sets the scene, I feel, in a really fantastic way because it knows that it's telling you something bizarre and strange, and it mentions all these other typical ghostly ideas like a witch being in an eggshell, and it's hinting at the inexplicable, as I was mentioning earlier. It's the type of story that can be likened to The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, which is one of the most famous ghost stories ever written, and which is frequently the one that people turn to as a kind of template of what a ghost story should be. And I feel that's very much because it leaves so much unexplained. It's so enigmatic. And that is what can make a ghost story truly great, when it leaves things unexplained. And I must say, while doing research for this evening and thinking about all the ghost stories I know, the ones that lingered with me most powerfully were the ones that left many unexplained ideas at the end. I'm going to read you a little extract from The Turn of the Screw to remind you how wonderfully written it is, and to jog your memories about how fantastically Henry James evokes the atmosphere of the story. It's from near the beginning. I can see Douglas there before the fire, to which he had got up to present his back, looking down at his interlocutor with his hands in his pockets. Nobody but me till now has ever heard. It is quite too horrible. This naturally was declared by several voices to give the thing the utmost price, and our friend, with quiet art, prepared his triumph by turning his eyes over the rest of us and going on. It's beyond everything. Nothing at all that I know touches it. For sheer terror? I remember asking. He seemed to say it was not so simple as that, to be really at a loss how to qualify it. He passed his hand over his eyes, made a little wincing grimace. For dreadful, dreadfulness! Oh, how delicious! Cried one of the women. He took no notice of her. He looked at me, but as if, instead of me, he saw what he spoke of. For general uncanny ugliness and horror and pain. So you can see how Henry James there is setting the scene for general uncanny ugliness and horror and pain. But also in that extract, we had one of the women saying, "Oh, how delicious." And that is that idea of delicious thrill, which ghost stories give us. We love that delicious thrill of the spine tingling fear that we get from a good ghost story. One of the ones that I have thought about a lot during this preamble to tonight is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, which is one of my favourite novels of all time, but also one of my favourite ghost stories. But it is an unusual ghost story because the ghost of Rebecca is never actually seen, and the power of the story is simply that Rebecca hovers over the book while never showing her presence. And the closest we ever get to seeing her as a ghost is when the unnamed heroine of the story, Mrs. De Winter, comes down the stairs wearing Rebecca, the dead Rebecca's clothing, and shocks and stuns the entire assembled throng because she shouldn't be doing that. And it's the dreadful Mrs. Danvers' idea that she would wear Rebecca's clothes. Ollie, thanks for your approval. Rebecca is my favourite too. It's such a fantastic book, and it is very spooky, even though there never really is an actual ghost or haunting. So anyone that hasn't read Rebecca, you must. But it's not really such a thrilling kind of ghost story. It's one that lingers with you forever in a very gentle and subtle way. One of my favourite authors who I've been reading for tonight is also Edward Benson, who is more famous for his series of novels, Map and Lucia, which are a fantastic comedy selection of novels. But these short stories that he wrote, which are all ghost stories, are all lovely and very memorable and often quite spine tingling stories too. They're not necessarily terrifying in the way that Edgar Allan Poe stories are, but they are all oddly memorable. So there's one of them called The Man Who Went Too Far, which is all about a very effete character who becomes obsessed with someone in his life, in on the periphery of his life, who seems to be constantly playing the panpipes. And our hero lies down and listens to the panpipes constantly in his hammock. Damien, I can't believe you didn't know that Benson was also a ghost story writer. You've got to discover them immediately. They are brilliant, and they're very surprising and odd. And definitely one of my favorites is The Man Who Went Too Far, about the panpipes. I won't reveal what happens because I don't want to give away the ending, but it is actually surprisingly brutal. Also, one of my other favorites ones of his in this collection is called Caterpillars, and that's a story that I would say is a metaphor, and I don't want to give too much away about it, but it's a metaphor for an illness, and it's really spooky and sinister and very, very strange, but brilliant. And I think what I love about Benson is that although he is being uh, spooky and strange, he also does have a lightness of touch, as with Map and Lucia, of course, which makes them all the more enjoyable. So even though you can see by the cover they've got this really kind of very spooky air, there's always something very lovely and human and light about his tales. So definitely read those. They're really fun and take you in all sorts of new directions in literature. So I'm looking forward to talking about those with you, Damien. Even if you do hate the panpipes, but maybe I can gently play some and convert you in some way. Probably not. I remember how you've always hated the panpipes. So moving on from Benson, who is a lovely writer, and you feel in very safe hands with him, I would now like to take you to one of the most brilliant and terrifying ghost stories of the last 100 years, which is Beloved by Toni Morrison. It's an amazing, brilliant, and wonderful book, which was written in 1987 and won the Pulitzer Prize. It's all about the terrible and traumatic after effects of slavery, and it's a book which will haunt you without a doubt. But even though it is haunting and horrifying, it's also full of the most beautiful and magical language. And it's unlike any other book that you will ever have read. It's also highly memorable as a film, I have to say. uh, Very memorably played by Tandy Newton, who was the beloved of the title. And I did think she really brought it to life. But let's get back to the book, which is fantastic. Damien, I'm dying to hear what you think Beloved is perfect for as bibliotherapy, because that's actually a really quite unsettling and worrying book. However, uh, if anyone doesn't know about the story, it's told in many different layers, and there are time flips going back and forth about 20 years, set in the 1870s. And it's about an ex slave called Setha who has had 4 children in her life. And one of them was murdered at her own hands, and this is Beloved. Setha murdered her daughter as a baby because she didn't want her to enter a life of slavery. Could there be a more horrific and brutal act in the whole of literature? The mother actually slits her baby's throat, and it is utterly horrific. Um, Damien, thanks for your comment that you think it's good for folk dealing with grief. I think that is a very good point because there's so much grief in this book. And although there's so much horror and death and blood, it also has an amazingly profound ability to bring that grief into life and to carry on living. And that actually is the message of the book, which does come out at the end of the book, that we should keep on living and looking forward, even though we also have to acknowledge the horrors of the past. And there are some amazingly memorable scenes in that book, which are some of them um, that I will just briefly mention is when Beloved first appears fully grown as a young woman. She comes out of the river and she's fully dressed. She's wearing a hat and her hat is dripping water. She comes out of the river and she lies next to the river with her eyes closed, barely able to open her eyes for a day. And then she finally makes her way to her mother's house and sits on the doorstep. And of course, her mother, Setha, does not know that this is her dead baby grown up. And it's completely terrifying and unbearably awful. But what we all love about Beloved is the way that she enters our hearts and remains completely full of rage. Even from when she was a baby, she was full of rage. And I'm going to read you the very beginning of the book, which expresses some of the rage of that baby who has been murdered. She has every reason to be full of rage, let's face it. 124 was spiteful, full of a baby's venom. The women in the house knew it, and so did the children. For years, each put up with the spite in his own way. But by 1873, Setha and her daughter Denver were its only victims. The grandmother, Baby Suggs, was dead, and the sons, Howard and Bugler, had run away by the time they were 13 years old. As soon as merely looking in a mirror shattered it, that was the signal for Bugler. As soon as 2 tiny handprints appeared in the cake, that was it for Howard. Neither boy waited to see more. Another kettle full of chickpeas smoking in a heap on the floor. Soda crackers crumbled and strewn in a line next to the doorsill. Nor did they wait for one of the relief periods, the weeks, months even, when nothing was disturbed. No, each one fled at once, the moment the house committed what was for him the one insult not to be borne or witnessed a second time. Within 2 months, in the dead of winter, leaving their grandmother, Baby Suggs, Setha, their mother, and their little sister Denver, all by themselves in the grey and white house on Bluestone Road. It didn't have a number then, because Cincinnati didn't stretch that far. In fact, Ohio had been calling itself a state only 70 years, when first one brother and then the next stuffed quilt packing into his hat, snatched up his shoes, and crept away from the lively spite the house felt for them. Baby Suggs didn't even raise her head. From her sickbed she heard them go, but that wasn't the reason she lay still. It was a wonder to her that her grandsons had taken so long to realize that every house wasn't like the one on Bluestone Road. Suspended between the nastiness of life and the meanness of the dead, she couldn't get interested in leaving life or living it, let alone the fright of two creeping off boys. That is a book that you want to keep reading and reading, and I found it quite hard to stop myself reading there. It's so gripping, and many of you are commenting about what a life-changing book it has been for you. So if there's anyone out there that hasn't read it yet, do. I also totally massively recommend it as an audiobook read by Toni Morrison herself, and she has such an incredible voice. She sounds like she is beloved, and it's just incredibly memorable, an amazing experience. Read it, listen to the audiobook, see the film. It's an incredible book. It actually very much reminds me also of another fantastic book, which is also about slavery, and that is Sugar Hall by Tiffany Murray. And Tiffany, it's great to see that you are here with us tonight. So this is one of my favorite recent ghost stories, and recently written, not about a recent ghost story. And I'm very intrigued that Tiffany actually writes about ghost stories often in her own novels. So one of Tiffany's books is also Diamond Star Halo, which also has quite a few ghosts in it. But so, Tiffany, I wonder if you are actually someone who's more alert to the presence of ghosts in life than some of us other lesser mortals. Very intriguing. So this book, Sugar Hall, is another book about a slave. It's based on the true story of a ghost from Little Dean, which is in the Forest of Dean. And the book takes place in 1955, at the time when Britain is preparing for its last hanging of the last woman that was hanged, which is Ruth Ellis. And the young hero of the book, whose name is Dieter, has come to this huge house, Sugar Hall, that he has inherited. And it's fantastically spooky, atmospheric, and beautifully written. And it includes one of the most haunting and tragic ghosts that I've ever met in literature. It's also a lovely book because it has these little pictures throughout, and snippets from the newspapers of the time, pictures of items from catalogues and so on. So that's another side of it that I really like. It's a very visual book with lists and so on. But getting back to the ghost story, it's one where the ghost appears quite early on, and he is the ghost of a black boy who's wearing a silver collar. And when he first appears, nobody knows why he's wearing a silver collar, but we gradually work it out that it's because he was, of course, a slave. And Dieter, the young boy who's the hero of the story, who's alive, a living boy, makes best friends with this young black boy. And we know from experience, literary and in reality, that this is not going to end well. And live boy and a ghost boy, surely not destined to be friends forever, but read the book and you will find out what happens. I'm going to read you a little bit of it because I really love Tiffany's writing, and I'd love you, if you don't know her writing, to experience the joy of the way she brings the characters so vividly alive so quickly. It's Sunday, Easter holidays, 1955, in Grandfather Sugar's house. When Dieter Sugar backed out of the long shed that edged the hall's red gardens, when he ran through the graveyard with its tiny headstones to make a stumbling shortcut across the grass meadow where frilled daffodils bobbed like sprung jack-in-the-boxes, when he sprinted past the black water of the ancient swimming pool onto the yellow gravel that made a sound like crunched sugar between teeth, and sugar was his name after all. When Dieter bounded up those grey steps into the ancient house that he could never think of as his, when he shot through that cathedral-sized hall that smelled of marzipan on account of the rat poison and not the cake his mother had told him, when he sprinted past the carved oak staircase and into the long room someone had named the reception, gliding to a stop on the polished floor, Dieter Sugar knew he was afraid. He was petrified. "What is it, Dee?" his mother asked as she unwrapped white tissue paper from small objects he'd forgotten were theirs. Dieter's words came out a jumble as he tried to tell his mother and sister what he'd seen. It was hard to put into words. There was a small boy, and the boy appeared out of thin air. And he, Dieter Sugar, was sure this boy was something different. He was almost certain this boy wasn't like any other boy he'd seen before. To begin with, the boy wore something bright around his neck, a silver collar. It had writing on it, but it had glinted in the sun, and Dieter couldn't read it. Read this book. You will be chilled and terrified, and you will also really enjoy it because it's got a lot of lovely, playful aspects too. It's by no means entirely haunting and tragic, but it does have aspects of those issues in it. So it's a definite must read for you lovers of ghost stories. I mentioned The Lovely Bones earlier, which is a story which weirdly gives some people hope in the afterlife because of the personal heaven that our heroine describes after being brutally raped and murdered. The Lovely Bones is a book which many people have ended up seeing as a film, so it doesn't require a lot of description from me. But I would say if you did enjoy The Lovely Bones, there's another book which not so many people have read and which I think is an amazingly terrifying analysis of a similar story, which is Dead Girls by Abigail Tartolin, which I think came out in 2015 after The Lovely Bones. And it's also a story of a young girl being raped and murdered. She's only 11 in this story. But what I love about it, it does also have ghosts in it. It has the ghost of the dead girl and the ghosts of several other dead girls also raped and murdered by the same man. Those girls are seeking vengeance, and the heroine who was actually murdered has a best friend called Theta, who decides that she is going to stop at nothing before she will get vengeance for her dead best friend. And it's an amazing and terrifying book about what girls will do for each other, how far they will go in order to seek justice, even beyond the grave. It's quite a shocking book. It has some very deep and dark issues, which I would love to discuss with anyone that's read it. I don't want to give it away too much for people that haven't read it, But let's go as far as to say that our heroine breaks some pretty shocking boundaries in order to help her best friend. She decides that the best way for her to help her best friend is to act as if she is bait for the murderer. So she decides to make herself into a lure for the guy that killed her friend. So that in itself is a terrifying and awful idea. And that comprises pretty much the second half of the book, is what happens when she goes into that mode. So it does go into some very worrying areas of the human psyche, and it's pretty much talking about underage sex, but it's very much based on the profound depths of friendship experience between young girls. So it does have a lot of amazing positives in it. And I think it's a book that does really make you think about the idea of ghosts, but also about extreme bonds of friendship. It's a worrying read, let's face it, but it is an excellent read too. So, one that I would recommend. Not necessarily a curative read, but one that makes you think about deep and dark issues. Um, Another common theme in ghost stories is stories that deal with libraries and books. And there's been quite a few excellent books about libraries and ghosts in libraries, and the way that we put our own ghosts into books. So one of those books, for instance, was The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón, which is a really lovely book, bit of a thriller, all about the way that books themselves can be ghosts and can contain ghosts. Then there's also this fantastic book by Audrey Niffenegger, well known for her fantastic novel, The Time Traveler's Wife. This is a book which is all about a woman who seeks her own life in the books that she's read. It's a strange and complex graphic novel which describes, in a way, the depression of our heroine, because she starts the book searching for or stumbling across the Midnight Library. It's called the Night Bookmobile. She stumbles across it, and in that van, she goes in, and it's like a TARDIS full of endless corridors of books. She discovers that her own books are actually all that mobile van is full of all the books that she's ever read in her entire life, and it's only devoted to her books. She realizes there's something a bit mysterious and strange about this library, and she keeps searching for it and going back for it over the years, but only ever seems to find it at strange moments in her life. And we eventually realize that there is something really rather sinister about this library, which I won't tell you or reveal what it is, but it's very ghostly. It's another book which I think does tackle issues of depression in a very subtle and brilliant and clever way. And although it is a sad book, it's also a very comforting book, which I think a lot of people experiencing depression would very much relate to. So it is a book that I do recommend to people perhaps feeling a bit sad, and they might then think about their own libraries and how they relate to their libraries. Thinking of other books of a similar ilk, books which deal with the idea of books being depositories of the soul, there's The Binding by Bridget Collins, published in 2019, which is a really powerful, interesting novel about the idea of binding emotions from your life and putting them into a book so that you then don't have to deal with them. And it's quite a mad, interesting, and surprising novel in which the hero realizes that he has placed some memories into a book. He's bound them into a book and he's then forgotten those memories. What could those memories be? He doesn't know. And it's a book which combines ideas about actual book binding, and it turns out that Bridget Collins actually did a course on book binding before she wrote the book, and that's why she became obsessed with the idea of binding books. Uh, so it's thinking about the binding of emotions into a book and then how they might eventually be released, whether you want to release them. And so it's another book that deals with ideas of emotions that you can't deal with and how you might find a way of putting them into a safe space to come back to later. And in a way, wouldn't we all like to do that if we are experiencing terrible anger or terrible grief or terrible depression? Maybe we would like to bind up those emotions and put them into a novel, into a book that you can leave on a shelf and then come back to another time. So in a way, that's not so much a literal ghost, if there is such a thing, but it's the idea of ghosting your own emotions and putting your emotions into a ghostly form so that you don't have to deal with them at the time. I really recommend The Binding. It is a really enjoyable novel. I would now like to, before it's too late, mention Beyond Black by Hilary Mantel, which is one of my favourite novels about ghosts. The heroine in Beyond Black, Alison, is a medium and she is constantly pursued by a whole bunch of ghosts. She actually has a constant companion of one ghost who is her um, spirit guide, and he used to be a clown in when he was alive. He's now dead, and he goes with her wherever she goes. And Alison travels around the London orbital, going to depressing towns just outside the M25, such as Potter's Bar, which is a place I know well because I used to live there, and Epsom. And she visits these places and takes her spiritual powers to those places. Apologies to anyone who is from Potter's Bar or Epsom. I know that they're lovely places, really, but in her book, they are really rather depressing. But that's partly because Alison, the medium, is only going to a massive great hallway where she meets lots of sad people who have lost loved ones and they want to talk to their beloved dead through Alison, the medium. It is a strange, wondrous, beautifully written book full of very, very black humour. It's called Beyond Black because the heroine, Alison, frequently mentions what is it that's beyond the black, beyond death, beyond the blackness of death. And in a way, she should know. She's the one that knows because she is the one that communes with the dead constantly. They're always sitting in the back of the car with her. Her spirit guide always travels with a posse of 5 or 6 other dead people who are farting, belching, frequently masturbating. They're all really terrible, unbearable people who've done awful things in their lives. And they're all connected with Alison's childhood. And this is one of the books about ghosts, which reflects upon the idea of your own demons being what's haunting you. So Alison is haunted by her own demons of the past, literally, because they have come back to hang out with her when she's an adult, even though they're dead. But during the course of the book, Alison the medium deals with her mediums in a quite emphatic fashion. And it is a very funny book, partly because of all these awful characters who are sitting with her, farting and belching and making rude comments about everyone. But also, Alison is accompanied by her assistant, whose name is Colleen, and she is and hello, Colleen. I see that you're with us. Not Colleen from Beyond Black, but one of our regular visitors. So Alison's assistant is called Colleen, and she is deeply lacking in sense of humor. She also doesn't really believe in Alison's powers, even though she witnesses them on a daily basis and constantly sees that Alison really does have an excellent relationship with the dead that enables her to explain to the living what's happening in their lives and what's happened to their dead loved ones. So it's a very complicated book. And by the way, sorry, the people on Facebook, it keeps cutting out, and I think it's actually my connection, not yours, Tiffany, in the Forest of Dean, that's causing it, or it is the ghosts which are attacking our internet. But Beyond Black is a really fantastic, very funny, very grim, very dark book, populated intensely with ghosts. And I'm just going to read you a little bit of it to give you a flavour of the writing. Travelling, the dank, oily days after Christmas. The motorway, its wastes looping London, the margins scrub grass flaring orange in the lights, and the leaves of the poisoned shrubs, striped yellow-green like a cantaloupe melon. 4 o'clock, light sinking over the orbital road. Tea time in Enfield, night falling on Potter's Bar. There are nights when you don't want to do it, but you have to do it anyway. Nights when you look down from the stage and see closed, stupid faces. Messages from the dead arrive at random. You don't want them and you can't send them back. The dead won't be coaxed and they won't be coerced. But the public has paid its money and it wants results. A sea green sky, lamps blossoming white. This is marginal land, fields of strong wire, of treadless tyres in ditches, bridges dead on their backs, and starving ponies cropping the mud. It is a landscape running with outcasts and escapees, with Afghans, Turks, and Kurds, with scapegoats scarred with bottle and burn marks, limping from the cities with broken ribs. The life forms here are rejects or anomalies, the cats tipped from speeding cars, and the Heathrow sheep, their fleece clotted with the stench of aviation fuel. Beside her, in profile against the flogged window, the driver's face is set. In the back seat, something dead stirs and begins to grunt and breathe. What I love about Hilary Mantel's writing in this book is there is this amazing sense of history. So when she's talking about the fields around the motorway and around Potter's Bar, she's mentioning the dead animals, the dead donkeys, the cows that have been there hundreds of years ago. And she's constantly talking about people from previous lives who would have been farmers or labourers or workers, which make it have a fantastic sense of history. And we all know that Hilary Mantel is brilliant at that from her amazing books about Cromwell. But I really love the way that she captures more recent history with this book, Beyond Black. And I thoroughly recommend it as a brilliant read, which is very cathartic. It does have a lot of demons that she chases down and conquers. And I think there's something very satisfying about that in any novel. So, on that Hilary Mantel note, I think I'll come to the end of this discussion about ghost stories, but I would love to hear if any of you have particular favourites that you would love to tell me about. Shirley Jackson has been mentioned. She is an amazing author, and there are many authors that I know I've missed out, but I would love to know who are your favourite ghostly writers of the last few hundred years, because it has been a tradition that has been going on since the time of Pliny. I will be doing, oops, there goes my phone falling off. Next week, I'm going to be doing a special live bibliotherapy session on my Ella Beartu Facebook page and on Instagram, which will be live from Exeter with Patrick Gale, who is one of the authors that I most frequently prescribe for bibliotherapy sessions. So do join me for that if you can on my Ella Beartu Facebook page and on Instagram. And next week, Damien Barr will be doing his own salon with Dolly Alderton, which is on Friday the 23rd. So that will be the last salon of this year. Book your tickets on Damien's Facebook page, on this Facebook page that we're on here. And I will keep going with my own bibliotherapy sessions over the next few weeks. And I'm also going to be doing another bibliotherapy session in a month's time here on Damien Barr's Literary Salon Facebook page, which will be all about snow in literature. So I look forward to seeing you there. And thank you all very much for coming tonight. M.R. James, Oliver Onions, Michel Paver, says Loretta. Very true. They're all people that I wanted to talk about and ran out of time. So thanks so much for coming, and I will see you all very soon. Good night.